Welcome to the Deconstruction Zone today. I am pleased to have a guest. Chris is a Ph.D. biblical scholar, and he's recently got on YouTube sharing his scholarship, sharing his journey with everyone here on the platform. So, Chris, if you could help us elucidate a little bit about your training and your educational experience and what your channel is all about, I would love for my viewers to be introduced to you because I've already watched most of your videos myself, but I don't know if everyone else already has.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me for a chance to have this conversation. This is going to be a lot of fun. Let me see where to start. I was kind of, the Christian kid was at church every time the door opened. I'll do a quick overview, and then if we want to dive deeper on anything, we can. But yeah, was at church every time the door opened. That kind of a kid. Dove into ministry as I grew up. Went to into camp ministry and music ministry, and played in a metal band for a while. And the church I was attending when I was about 19 kind of came to me and said, "We think that God is calling you to be our youth pastor," and that is a invitation that's hard to turn down for a 19-year-old. So I became a youth pastor, and I was a youth pastor for maybe 8 or 9 years. During that time, I wanted to get accredited to be a full-fledged pastor. So I decided to go and get a Master of Divinity, which is the degree that helps you do that. So I enrolled in a local seminary, which turned out to be an Episcopalian seminary, and that was, I mean, I don't think it was a mistake in retrospect, but if I was going to stay a fundamentalist, that was a mistake, because I started learning biblical languages and New Testament text criticism, Hebrew Bible text criticism, things like that. Theology, reading a lot of theology, church history, and over time, that journey started my deconstruction process. And I spent 3 years doing a Master of Divinity. I did a Master of Arts in Theology after that, and then I went and did a Ph.D. in Christian origins in a religious studies department. So
That's actually pretty heavy. I didn't realize you
that's the Cliff's
had
Notes. Yeah.
two master's degrees in there prior to your PhD. Um, did you study roughly the same fields as you were going through your master's into your PhD, or was there some variation there?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way that it works I'm in Canada, which maybe you can tell from my accent. So we generally follow. It's a bit of a mixture of the UK and the American model. So in some American schools, you get your master's and PhD at the same time. It just, I mean, depends on the school. There are different ways to do it, but the way it worked, I was only intended to do the Master of Divinity, and the Master of Divinity was just really broad. It was a lot of as I said, a lot of biblical languages, like read a lot of systematic theology, church history. It was just the really broad-based training they thought you would need to be a minister. So I did, I guess maybe I was about 2 years into that, and I had taken a bunch of extra courses because I liked the languages so much, and I was getting kind of ready for something a little more challenging. So I asked if I got kind of special permission to do a Master of Arts in Theology, which is more like a thesis-based project. So I wrote a master's thesis on Greek philosopher Philo, who was a first century Alexandrian Greek philosopher, Jewish. So I should have also said he's
Yeah.
Jewish, which is important for this conversation. So I compared Philo to a book called Four Maccabees, which is not in the Septuagint of most. Well, it's not in the Septuagint, but it is in several traditions. I don't remember which traditions have it in their canon, but anyway, it's kind of like in the vein of the other Maccabee stories. It's a book about seven brothers dying for their faith, but it's very heavily influenced by Hellenistic philosophy and Stoicism. So I compared those two for my master's thesis. So that was like, one was a lot more courses, which was a really good general education in Christian history, and the other one was very specifically like a master's thesis. Although I did, now that I think about it, I think I did graduate level courses for the master's too. So
Sounds like a lot of fun. I remember being in New Testament classes and getting to see some of the, we'll say, the Greek philosophy and how it fed into Christian theology, especially with like Philo, and
yeah.
the introduction of the Logos and some of his interesting themes. And I'm still tickled sometimes about some of the things Philo said. But I unfortunately I don't get to dive deeply into some
Like
of these sources.
Plato borrowed from Moses, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The Christians said that too, though. They like that argument. Everything good must have come from Moses.
And there's another section in Philo where he talks about how the gender of your baby can be determined based on like the righteousness of the father. Um,
Oh, I don't even remember that.
it's a wild,
Jeez.
a wild
That's
one.
that's crazy. I'll have to go look that up. There's so much in Philo too. I mean, there's so much to read, and I certainly didn't do it all justice because the dude wrote a lot. But yeah, that's funny.
So
Yeah, some weird stuff.
you've got a pretty heavy education in New Testament studies. Is that kind of where your passion was when you were in school, was studying the New Testament, or did you want to just really study the Bible in its entirety so that you can just get into ministry?
Yeah, I think when I started, I'm trying to think. Like, I think I was a little bit cynical because maybe it was because it was Episcopalian. Geez, I can't say the word. We call it Anglican here in Canada, so I'm saying
Yeah.
Episcopalian for the courtesy of American viewers. But yeah, I mean, when I started seminary, I think it was almost like a piece of paper. Like I knew
Mm.
that I wanted to be a pastor. I was like, okay, God's called me to do this. I don't really need an education, go figure. But I need a piece of paper just so a church will hire me. So I don't think I really took it that seriously when I signed up. I took it seriously. I did the work. I'm not saying I didn't take that part seriously, but I didn't really give a lot of thought to like what do I need to study to become the best pastor I can possibly be. I really just took courses that interested me. But the one thing I do remember was that the seminary had a lot of sort of touchy feely like ministry stuff, and I didn't really want to do any of that stuff. So I just did a lot of extra language courses. So I did a lot of Greek, a lot of Hebrew. I think the thing that it was a weird evolution because the thing that interested me most at first was actually systematic theology. So I was reading a lot of well,
Wayne
a
Grudem.
lot of theology. Definitely not Wayne Grudem. It wasn't evangelical seminary. There was no Wayne Grudem in that particular
Oh, thank
seminary
goodness.
with respect to the man. I actually didn't even know who he was until I had told an evangelical friend I was going to seminary, and he said, "Oh, you must have read Wayne Grudem." And I'm like, "Who the heck is that?" So no, I was more reading people like Karl Barth and like,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
like people like Calvin, like reading actually original theologians or Aquinas or so. Yeah, I mean, I was getting a very good education in theology, and I wanted. I just also really liked the theology prof was really cool, and I had taken a lot of courses there, and some in hermeneutics. I enjoyed hermeneutics too, and I was getting a little bit more into that kind of angle of things. But I don't know why I just drifted to history. My undergraduate was history, and I just drifted back towards the history. So Philo and Four Maccabees got me like back to that era somehow, and I don't even really know how I settled on that. I was gonna do something about like some German philosopher at first when I started, and then I think I got money to do that from the government, and then I switched to something else. So yeah, so I ended up doing Philo and Four Maccabees, and then found I as much as I do enjoy and respect the philosophy, I really enjoy social history a lot more. That's kind of where my bread and butter was and in my PhD, I mean, we can talk more about this, but I got into a lot of Greek inscriptions and papyri, and I
Oh,
found there was a lot of thrill of working with material culture like that, and I found that I almost felt like I was uncovering things, whether I was or not. I don't know, but that I really enjoyed that process. So I just moved kind of from theology to history, I would say.
I think that's a kind of a natural course of things. I didn't make it as far as you in the educational process. I stopped after my NDiv, but I felt I went in just like you to be in ministry, and then I fell
Mm.
in love with academic education and with the learning and things like that. But I'm curious, as people are listening to this, there's a percentage of people that are going to be watching this and thinking, well, Chris was never a real Christian, which is why he didn't go into ministry. He got deterred or, different things like that, or, he was not fertile ground. um,
Yeah,
what,
that's right.
what type of Christian were you prior to your educational experience, and how do you kind of see yourself now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I remember very clearly the conversion experience I had when I was 7 or 8. There was an evangelist came to our church and preached, an evangelisty sermon. And I didn't go up at the altar call. I was too much of a chicken, but I went up outside after and I knelt down and I asked Jesus into my heart. There were a lot of times over the years, I think like most evangelical kids, when I had that kind of experience, that moment of re. I I was in a once saved, always saved church, but I also was in an extreme end times church. So I certainly had moments where I was like, did it really take? Because I really don't want the rapture to happen and I'm stuck here. So let's pray the prayer just to be safe, you know? So I'm sure I recommitted my life to Christ over the years. But no, I mean, I think if, if somebody's determined to believe I wasn't a Christian, I don't really know what I could do to convince them. But I loved God. I prayed all the time. I believed that my steps were being ordered by God, and had a lot of, just kind of ongoing things that I thought was God showing up in my life. And very, I remember spending entire nights praying all night, basically, with both by myself and with friends for various things. Praying with my church all night for revival, things like that. I was a very, very serious evangelical Christian.
Yeah. And I think that's why you decided to pursue the academic rigor that you did, not
Yeah.
because you were unserious about it, because it's a big commitment. For people who don't know, to get a PhD in a theological field, it takes a long time. How many years did you spend getting your degrees?
You mean all told from the beginning?
Mhm.
Yeah. Was it 10? Hold on, I have to count quick. But I ended up compressing the MDiv and the MA into 4 years, and then I think I spent 6 or 7 on my PhD, maybe 6. So it was either 10 or 11 years. That's post bachelor's. So
Yeah.
I did a 4 year undergrad first, but yeah, so 10 or 11 years specific to religious studies and New Testament.
And so a lot of people don't realize, like, you can be a pharmacist in 6 years, graduate high school, you're a pharmacist 6 years. To be a PhD in this field of study, you spend 10 to 12 years in academic rigor doing it. So
Yeah.
I know it might be easy for people on the outside to look at your deconstruction journey and say, well, he went to the wrong school, or, if only he knew the right theology, he'd come out on the other side with a different perspective. But like, what more could a person do? You went to school for 12 years and studied with actual experts. And, I would say your position now probably is not of, that of a fundamentalist conservative Christian that believes that the end time is imminent, and that, if you don't cross your I's and dot your T's, you could accidentally end up in hell.
No, I do still that yeah, that's a good question. I didn't say anything about where I ended up. So I do still identify as a Christian, which I say on my YouTube channel a lot. I did go through a very very serious deconstruction, and part of it was people don't we don't realize that the Christianity you're given is a very specific type of Christianity that was birthed in the 20th century. And when you're raised in it, it's like swimming in an ocean, and you're just like, this is what it is. This is what water is. There's no other water. Why would you ever swim in any other water? And then you realize, gee, this wasn't actually an ocean. It was just a swimming pool, and the ocean is over there. I don't know. So maybe my metaphor is a little bit labored, but
It's a good one.
um, yeah, it's you realize that the things that you believe are true, and how can you know unless you have somebody challenge that belief? And unfortunately, I think a lot of fundamentalists live in a world where they don't ever get their beliefs challenged. And I think, people will argue that fact, but ultimately what happens is if you live in a world where you get your information about the Bible from your pastor, maybe everybody you know is a
Right.
Christian. I was in an extreme, not always. I went to a lot of different types of evangelical churches, but the church I was raised in particularly was very extreme in like shunning outsiders. So we didn't have much contact with the
Oh,
outside
really?
world. No, it was very well. I'm saying that wrong. It wasn't shunning outsiders wasn't the right way to say it, but we were talking about reaching the lost, but we certainly didn't have any relationships with people who weren't, evangelical Christians at that time. So yeah, it was when you go through life in an environment like that, and then you come up against Christian apologetics. So even the small amount of questions you might have that are kind of interesting to follow, and maybe you should have those questions, you get these cookie cutter answers that you can memorize and feel good about keeping your faith in the same box that it was always in. So I think like I still identify as a Christian, but I don't know that a lot of people I was raised with would agree with that,
Right.
with my opinion of myself. Now, last I checked, it's between me and God, so I don't think that actually matters anyway. But
Pretty sure.
yeah, if I'm pretty sure that's like the one theological thing is like who's the one who gets to judge? I forget. Anyway, but I identify now as a much more progressive Christian,
Mhm.
I guess. Even I mean, I don't even completely like the label progressive or liberal Christian. Those are problematic. But I stay in the Christian tradition because that's my religious tradition, essentially.
Right.
So
I think
yeah,
that's a great thing about deconstruction. I know you're addressing some deconstruction topics on your channel. Is,
yeah,
not everyone ends up in the same position. You could end up still in the faith. You could end up agnostic. You can end up liberal. You can end up leaving the faith and even joining another one. For a lot of people have deconverted from Christianity into Judaism, even.
yeah,
So I think the goal of deconstruction is not to make atheists. That's never been my goal. I don't know if that's it should be the goal that people are working at. I think the goal of deconstruction is to look at everything critically and ask, what parts of this should we be keeping and why are we keeping it? And if we're going to take a part of it and do away with it, do we have a good reason to do away with it? Should we be doing away with it? So it's just the opposite of construction. You're just taking things apart because we're given a complete picture as we're growing up in the church or in a family.
mm,
They're saying
yeah,
this is the thing, and you have to
yeah,
accept all of it, right? But then you get to
yeah,
adulthood and you start thinking, well, maybe I don't have to accept all of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. It was yeah, I mean, I studied, so even I think the words atheist and theist, there's a very specific kind of Western idea of how to think about belief, that like religion is basically just about whether you believe in a man in the sky or not. And I think what my PhD, I didn't say this, but it was I did Christian origins, we call it, but it was in a religious studies department, so I was actually just studying religion. And when you study religion, I mean, you're looking at a lot of the a lot of the things that I experienced growing up. You're seeing that replicated all over the world in different contexts and what we would consider different religions. And a lot of it is just human behavior. And I think that was what helped me to kind of stick with my identification as a Christian over time, was that it's not that I don't even think that my worldview is uniquely right and everybody else is wrong. I don't even have that idea, that very tribalistic God that I was raised in. But this is much more just like my cultural identity, my tradition, my I don't know, I sometimes I call it like my language for unknown things. So if there is something metaphysical, this is the way that I relate to it, is through this
Right.
tradition. So yeah, so it's complicated. I think too, when I mean, I've been really privileged to live all over the world. So I'm like, each place I lived helped me reassess my own faith and my own culture. So I lived in Germany and was very kind of immersed in the world there of like the Evangelical Lutheran Church for a little bit. I lived in Greece, and like living in a Greek Orthodox world is wild. It's just like nothing you've ever experienced. Where it's just in the air. It's a religion is like the Greek Orthodox religion is just so. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. The next, if somebody's been to Italy, that would also maybe be a comparable thing, like where the Catholic Church has a lot of hold there. But it's yeah, it was wild. Lived in the UK and reconnected with the Anglican Church there, and so it's just like every place you go, it just makes your world a little bigger, And if you have that little tribalistic local God who just really likes the way that you pray and the way that you believe, and the things that you say more than anybody else in the world, I mean, you better try and stay in that box, because if you start traveling and meeting people and actually listening to people, you're gonna get pushed out of it pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah, actually
Yeah.
that was part of my experience as well, deconstructing, because I used to do apologetics and whatnot, and I was talking to people around the
Mm,
world, on the internet doing apologetics, and I came to realize that like a lot of them, like their rationale behind their belief was really similar to mine. Like it turned out I
yeah.
didn't hold anything special. I couldn't put anything on a plate and say this is the thing that proves my religion is true. And so that was kind of a humbling experience.
Yeah.
And for a while, I thought the Bible was that thing. But as I
Yeah.
studied the Bible, cracks in the wall started to develop. And I assume you had a similar experience. And, if not, feel free to correct me. But I assume at some point, some of the fundamentalist ideas that you were raised to believe or you learned in church started to those buckets didn't hold water anymore. Were there any like initial, what was the initial phases like for you when you started to realize the scholarship and fundamentalism don't actually always agree with each other?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm trying to think about something clever to say about like the worst trick the devil pulled was convincing fundamentalists that the Bible was inerrant or something. Um,
Mhm.
I think, I mean, it's biblical inerrancy is. I've said this. I say this in like almost every video I make because people need to hear it again and again. It's not. I mean, it's a 20th century idea, late 19th, 20th century idea. It was a pushback to historical criticism of the Bible. So it literally was a response, as often is if you study the history of Christianity. Often it's like, we don't like that. We're going to go even more extreme, which is basically what biblical inerrancy was. And um, if you look through history, I mean, the Bible has always been very important to Christians through history. I'm not saying that the Bible wasn't important, you know, but if you understand that the Bible was shaped by the church for the first 400 years of its existence, and the earliest Bibles have different books in them and different readings, and that tradition evolved, and even reformers like Martin Luther or Calvin had a very different relationship to the Bible than we do. I'm saying we, than modern fundamentalists do. Um, so that belief basically in biblical inerrancy was specifically made up in the 20th century. And even with that, I think of something like the creationist movement. I didn't even know this, that when Darwin first kind of came out with the origin of the species, apparently, and I've done a little bit of reading on this. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but apparently there was not that much of a pushback at first, that Christians were kind of just like, okay. And then when young earth creationism came around in, I'll say like the 60s maybe, all of a sudden this whole backlash, and it spread through churches and spread through mass media, and all of a sudden every Christian had to believe the world was 6,000 years old, and that to believe otherwise was a challenge to your faith. So when you look at the world through this inerrancy lens, or when you look at the history of how inerrancy developed and realize it's nonsense. You don't even have to believe it to be a Christian, which is shocking. I know, if that's all you've ever heard. Anyway, that's kind of my preamble to say that yes, I did hold that coming into seminary. I did think the Bible was inerrant, and I remember just little things. The death of Judas was a big one.
Yeah.
Realizing that there are two contradictory stories about the death of Judas, and for the first time, I think I had memorized an apologist argument about how, oh yeah, the rope broke, he hung himself, and the rope broke, and he fell, and his bowels gushed open, um, and somebody had kind of mentioned to me in passing, somebody at seminary had mentioned that to me in passing, and I think I had in my brain said, yeah, that's not a contradiction, and then I went home and looked it up and was like, oh crap, this is very clearly a contradiction, and there's like four different things in the story, four or five, that contradict
Yeah.
each other. And
Who
it's not
bought the
just about the
field?
rope and who bought the field. Did he bring the money back, or did he keep
Hmm.
the money? Did he feel remorse, or did he? You don't get any sense in Acts that he felt remorse, and so and I mean, when you come up against something like that, you can either stick your head in the sand, I guess. I don't know. I couldn't really get around it, and if anything, I think the thing that I always had was a devotion to what was true, and it was hard, but I kind of kept looking at it. It was like picking a scab. I had to keep know what else wasn't true in the Bible, what else was contradictory in the Bible. So yeah, I mean that's kind of just reading. I have a video on my channel where I talk about some of the biblical contradictions that cost me my faith. But sitting in Hebrew Bible class and reading the two creation stories beside each other in Genesis 1
Yeah.
and 2, and learning the documentary Hypothesis, and seeing, holy crap, this is very convincing. you
Yep.
know Excuse me. So yeah, I mean, it was that slow death of a thousand cuts for biblical inerrancy, and then when that's what your faith is built on, that ultimately your faith is in a book that is very, blatantly wrong and has a lot of mistakes in it. Um, when the book goes, so does your faith. So that definitely was what prompted the beginning of my deconstruction.
Right. That's
Yeah.
a really good point, though, because if you're part of the Protestant church, or the Protestant churches, especially if you're part of a fundamentalist church, there's kind of this idea that, well, if the Bible's not true, then none of it's true. Like if the Bible's not
Yeah.
inerrant, then everything falls apart. But I don't know if that follows. It could certainly be possible that the Bible does contain contradictions. It does contain things that are not historically accurate, but it could also be that there are true things in it as well. So, in your current position, you obviously don't need the biblical inerrancy to be true for you to have some form of faith. But a question Christian friend of mine asked a while back, and that was a really good question. I thought he's a believer. He's still kind of he doesn't hold on to biblical inerrancy anymore, but he tries to, right? But he said, "Can you know God without the Bible? Like if somebody wanted to know about God, could they in fact know anything about God if they didn't have the Bible?" And I'm curious to know how you would respond to this one.
I guess it's a tough question because it's culturally conditioned. Because historically, you would know God through the church or through being born into it, and it's just Christianity's in your town. But yeah, I mean, with the Protestant Reformation and a push to sola scriptura, all of a sudden you have a decrease of any kind of church authority, and evangelicals have taken this even further. A lot of evangelicals are totally just unmoored to any. Sorry, I'm just gonna take my shirt off. A lot of evangelicals are totally unmoored. I just said that funny. I'm not taking my
The
shirt off.
the
Just to be clear.
the fires of hell are getting
Uh,
closer, Chris.
yeah, that's right. Oh, that's why. Oh God. Um, yeah, what was I saying? Oh yeah,
You were
the
busy
I
suppressing the
think
truth and unrighteousness.
yeah. I think it's I mean, the Christian tradition is a rich tradition. So I think, I mean, there is if I was in Greece, I wouldn't have probably ever read the Bible, but I would still be a Greek Orthodox Christian had I been born there and lived there. So however, I think in modern secular America it's a lot more difficult. And I think one of the things I'm surprised with now is occasionally more and more often meeting people who've never actually read the Bible, because
Yeah.
for a certain like for my parents' generation, you kind of could assume that they had some contact somewhere, that they'd been in a Sunday school somewhere. Even if they weren't regular churchgoers, they had a bit of history with the Christian tradition. But yeah, increasingly, that's not happening. So I think I'm straying away from your question, which was, could we know God without the Bible? Um, I don't know. Which God, I guess. Who?
Right. It's not an easy question. I know it's a tough one.
Yeah. I don't know. It's like, I think the revelation argument would be that's like our that maybe we need it, but yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer to it. I just rambled for 3 minutes without actually answering the question. So I don't know.
It is a difficult question. I came up with something similar. My opinion was if the God exists, then certainly if he wants you to know about him or her or it, that it would have revealed itself in some way, whether it was to the masses or whether it was on a personal level. And I don't know if you need the Bible to be perfect in order to know that the God is speaking through it. But that does open the door to some really spicy questions, which is if you could know God without the Bible, then is it possible that you can know God without Christianity? And that
Yeah,
is a whole
right.
different
Yeah.
ball of wax.
Well, we had I don't know if you had this growing up, but a lot of the traditions I've been a part of recognize, like, it is a really difficult line to walk to say, like, oh well, everybody who lived before Jesus who wasn't Jewish were just throwaway people, basically, that
Yes.
they don't matter. Everybody who's never heard the gospel doesn't matter because we're so then people would make up these weird things about, like, oh well, I mean, Calvinism helps you get around this because then it's just all the elect and it doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, I think for people trying to square that circle, it was really tricky. Like, oh well, maybe they had dreams about Jesus, or some people would say, oh, they followed their own. The C.S. Lewis even has this thing in The Last Battle where it's very kind of like, I don't know if you know have you read The Last Battle? Am I going off on a tangent
I've
here?
not read The Last
No.
Battle. I read Mere
Okay.
Christianity, and I didn't find it very persuasive, even as a Christian. So,
No, I don't think
so I
so.
didn't read
Yeah, me
anything
too.
else.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, the Narnia series is basically his kind of Lord of the Rings answer to Lord of the Rings. But in The Last Battle, there's this scene with this guy who's like ostensibly Muslim who comes in, and it is before Aslan, who's the picture of Jesus, I guess. And Aslan says to him, like, basically anything you did for your God, you were doing for me, even if you didn't know it, which was like really interesting theology
Yeah.
from C.S. Lewis, the evangelical he wasn't evangelical, but evangelicals like him. So yeah, I mean, there's that kind of approach, but I don't know. I think it's just a very interesting question. However, let me respond by saying one thing that I kind of worked out as I was opening the door to the possibility of, belonging in a faith tradition again, was that if there is a God, actually the reverse, like, God has to be bigger than my tradition. Like, God has to be bigger than just my
Right.
box that I put him or her or it in, which is a lot more interesting to think about. That regardless of the specifics of whether I have a revelation or not, that if God is truth, then God couldn't be tribalistic. You know, if there is a universal, all loving God, it couldn't just be a tribal God.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think there's some echoes of this in the New Testament as well, and I'd love to get some of your feedback on it because I always felt that there was a little bit of a tension between some of the teachings of Jesus and some of the teachings of Paul. Jesus, he does say like in the book of John that no man comes to the Father except through me, so you get some of that kind of stuff, but you also get some really interesting passages like Matthew 25 where when he talks about the coming judgment, right? It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, right? So this is all the people of the world, not the Jewish people. All the people of the world, presumably some of these people never knew Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's judging all the people of the world, both Jew and Gentile, in this particular passage. And he says, then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. And I was in prison, and you visited me. So in Jesus's judgment of the nations, of the people of the world, there's nothing mentioned about like, well, you had to believe the right thing. It actually is about
Yeah.
taking care of people, which really opens the door wide to think if Jesus is coming back to judge all people, some people never heard of Jesus. Is it possibly true that people who are just being good to others inherit the kingdom just by mere virtue of being good?
It's, I think, I mean, I think the New Testament doesn't have one idea of salvation. I think there's multiple ideas, and each of the gospel writers probably has different ideas of salvation. I
Right.
mean, there's you do get a lot more, and I know progressive Christians end up going a lot more to this type of Jesus. You know, the Jesus who's a lot more interested in caring for the poor and basically kind of a social justice warrior. It was the Albert Schweitzer was the guy who wrote about the quest for the historical Jesus. Like, is that 100 years ago yet? I don't know, a
It's
long
been a
time ago.
minute.
Yeah, and he basically said people look into the. It's like, I think he said it's like looking into the well. People look for the historical Jesus, and it's like looking into the well of history and seeing their own reflection. You know, that people
Hmm.
basically see what they want to see there. But yeah, I mean, I think if you read the Gospels, you get a lot more of a sense of like caring for the poor. You get those types of things. And Paul, I'm not even sure that Paul is. I mean, like Romans, for example. Romans is the famous one that we used to do the Romans Road, right, and try to lead people to Christ with the Romans Road, and you just
Right.
have to read all the right verses. When you take those verses and stop, cherry picking them and actually read Romans, Paul's pretty clearly trying to figure out how the Jews and Gentiles can be in the covenant together. It's really about the Gentiles being brought in, and this has led to a lot of biblical scholarship on Paul in the last. So I'm just hearing a voice. A lot of biblical scholarship on Paul in the last like 50 years has been, for example, the so-called New Perspective, which basically is this argument that Jews weren't just struggling to keep the law and couldn't do it, and were trying to be good and couldn't be, and so a lot of the biblical scholarship on Paul has even complicated the idea that Paul was ever just about getting saved. I'm not even sure that you can see that modern idea of salvation there. And the modern idea of salvation requires things like our modern idea of personhood, which really came out of the Enlightenment, the kind of individualistic identity that we now all kind of take for granted. But you look at the themes of salvation in the New Testament, there's certainly some individual salvation there, but I think a lot of times you see communal salvation, you see a lot more interesting group identity and how you get into the right group, So you see themes like you do see a little bit of atonement, like basic atonement theory. Full substitutionary atonement theory wasn't really invented until the 11th century, with Anselm of Canterbury kind of created the foundations, and Luther and Calvin built on it. But yeah, I mean, you don't really get a really drawn out soteriology in the New Testament. I think that's I don't know. That's a very broad strokes answer, but I think it's true. Like, I think you get a lot of different pictures of what's happening, and even Paul, I think, is I remember like when I first realized how tenuous Paul's position seems to be in a lot of his communities. Like if you actually read his letters, you realize people aren't actually listening to him, and it's difficult to get the sense of
Yeah.
somebody who. So it's like if you actually read Paul a little bit critically, and you look at this guy who needs to turn around and you know, on one hand say the law doesn't matter, and then on the other hand say like, oh, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews, you know, in every respect perfect under the law. I think he's just kind of a chameleon. I think he
Hmm.
was whoever needed to be to try to maintain his authority and position. Maybe that's being a little cynical, but I think if you actually just sit and like go read, I don't know, go read Second Corinthians, go read, like you see that Paul is really not super authoritative, and we kind of read him very authoritative now. But I think when he's jockeying for position, he kind of makes different arguments that suit his purpose at a particular time. That and not all the letters that are attributed to Paul are actually Paul. So anyway, I went off on some tangents there, but did that kind of
Well,
that kind of answer the question?
yeah, you did. And the last thing you said, I think, is actually really interesting. So there's been a lot of debate over what are some of the authentic letters of Paul. And some scholars have pointed out, like, the letters to Timothy say things that appear to be contradicting what's in Paul's other letters.
Yeah,
Like, what
and
are
that's
some of
both a
the,
mystery.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what would be some of like the hallmark signs for Christians to look for in terms of Pauline authentication? Like, if you're reading, say, one of the letters of Paul, what are some of the markers we could look for? Like, if I was looking for whether or not Chris wrote a letter or spoke a voice message, I'd be like, oh well, I can detect a Canadian accent, so it must be from from
I
Chris.
say A lot. Yeah. No, it's a good question. I'm not. I did write a little bit on Paul in my dissertation, but I don't consider myself a Pauline scholar by any stretch. So I'll try to do a basic justice to the answer. But it's 7 letters, considered genuine by most scholars. Galatians, First Thessalonians. So First Thessalonians is genuinely. This one says Galatians is first. I think First Thessalonians is generally thought to be first. First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, and Second Corinthians could be multiple letters put together.
Hmm.
Romans, Philippians, Philemon. So those are the authentic letters of Paul, as most scholars consider them. And then yeah, Second Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians are debated, and scholars are pretty sure that he didn't write First and Second Timothy and Titus. I forget what I'm missing. I'm not looking at my list anymore. But the way that they do it is essentially to look at. I mean, when you're dating anything, the way that for example, the way that we date the Gospels is usually around the fall of the temple in 70. So you can look for historical things, but what you get more when you're dating things like the letters of Paul, or the so-called pseudepigraphic letters of Paul, the fake letters of Paul, you're really looking for theology that. Well, people look at language. I think, like, as somebody who reads Greek, even when you put up a letter like First Thessalonians next to like Timothy or something, you see like a difference in the Greek. So it is about the language, is part of it. But then some people say, well, he was using different scribes, or had amanuensis, which is somebody who wrote for him. Um, Fine. The other, I think, more common argument is that when you see a letter of Paul referring to a theological problem that wasn't actually a problem in Paul's lifetime,
Mm.
that's when you start to really know that you're dealing with something that's probably not authentic to Paul. Yeah, so that's like that's really broad strokes how it works. I wish I knew more about it. It's not really an area I know a ton about, but yeah, I've listened to people talk about it. But the thing about scholarship, after describing all of my excellent education, is that you spend a lot of your time in a PhD focused on a very narrow field of studies. So one of the reasons I wanted to start doing YouTube videos was actually to start to teach myself, not teach myself is the wrong word. I've read most of it before, but start to get back into some of the stuff that I've forgotten or haven't got to spend enough time on. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we definitely look forward to more videos coming out. The first video I saw that you produced was on the synoptic problem.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting topic. And a lot of my viewers, and I think a lot of people in general, are curious about the relation of the Gospels. And I think I might kind of understand why that is the case. Because in the circles I run in, the question relies on, are there eyewitnesses? And
Mm-hmm.
as far as we can tell, the best eyewitnesses, if there are any, are found in the Gospels. So that seems to be where the most weight is given. But there are some problems calling them
Mm.
eyewitnesses, and who's copying from who, and when were they copying, and different things like that. What's your opinion on the synoptic problem, Markan priority, and some of these issues? Do you have a solid position?
No, I don't. I don't think I actually have a super solid position. I can kind of describe what it is. I mean, essentially, like scholars have known for, I think almost. Am I going to say 200 years? Maybe not quite that long, but it's been a long time that scholars have known that the Gospels have a literary relationship to each other, so they copy each other. And then, I mean, a lot of people will ask the natural question: weren't they just eyewitnesses, who are describing the same events and just happen to say the same things? No, they copy each other. So one of the reasons I do this in my videos, I often put the text up in Greek, because even in English, you can kind of make, well, I don't know, even in English, I think you can see that there's a problem there. But in Greek, you get the Gospels agreeing word for word for word for word over sentences and paragraphs, sometimes with very small changes. But you can see without, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they're copying each other. When I was used to TA for undergraduate courses, we would run essays through Turnitin.com, and if you get like four, I think it was four words in a row, it would flag that maybe there's something plagiarisy going on here. So if you were to run Matthew and Luke, for example, through with the Gospel of Mark, you'd realize that they share hundreds of verses and hundreds of occasions where there's more than four words in a row, or often there will be. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the way that scholars usually reconstruct this, we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and there's not much debate about that. There's pretty commonly accepted that Mark was the first gospel writer. So Mark wrote, people say usually around 70. There's give or take 5 years on either side maybe, but people say around 70. And then both Matthew and Luke copied from Mark and used Mark as a source. There's ongoing questions of whether Matthew and Luke knew each other, which I'll mention in a minute in reference to something else, because I'll try and go slow just to not lose anybody here. Yeah, so Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source. Now, so that's interesting and it's cool, and you can line up and see how they use Mark, for example. But it's also being recognized for about probably 150 years that Matthew and Luke share a lot of material that's not in Mark. So you have this situation where they have um, similar if not identical material at times. It often corresponds with things that Jesus is saying. So you get the sayings of Jesus that are often identical, and then sometimes the narrative around is framing them a little differently. So what scholars have hypothesized for about 150 years, I think, but it's been really much more developed in the last maybe 50 years, is that there's 50 years. I'm thinking like 1970. Yeah, that's 50 years ago. Maybe
It's
the
hard to
last
believe it
70
was that
years.
long ago.
I know. I still think of 1970 as 30 years ago. I'm perpetually
Right.
stuck in the year 2000. Anyway, so scholars have generally assumed that there's another lost gospel behind Luke and Matthew. This is often called the Q gospel, or the Q source, which is from the German word Quelle, meaning just source. So it's just a source text, unknown source text. Scholars have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to reconstruct it and recreate it and figure out what it might have looked like. And there's a little bit of narrative in it. I think that the temptation of Jesus, parts of it. Mark has a bit of a temptation, but Matthew and Luke have something much more of a temptation story, where you get these kind of back and forth with the devil. There's kind of, I think, agreement that was probably also part of Q, but overall, a lot of Q is sayings, traditions, things Jesus said. So, for example, you get material from the Beatitudes that is shared. Matthew has a lot more Beatitudes than Luke has, but they both say, for example, blessed are the poor. Luke says, blessed are the poor, and then Matthew actually says, blessed are the poor in spirit. So that's how you get those kind of slight changes, but we can see when you lay them out, you can see that they're probably sharing a source. So that's the Q hypothesis. It's still, as far as I know, it's still pretty commonly. I think I don't actually know like if it's still the majority position. There has been a pushback. Pushback's not the right word, but there's an alternative explanation that people call the fair hypothesis. That's also quite common. And this is most notably, I think Mark Goodacre is the person who has advanced this in recent years. So in this hypothesis, the idea is that Luke knew Matthew and Mark, so Luke was adopting from Matthew and writing from Matthew, so that it kind of explains why they share material together. So that's essentially the alternative to Q. I'm personally more convinced by Q. I think there probably was a different sayings gospel behind Matthew and Luke. And then this has gotten even more. I mean, just stop me if I'm boring you, because
No, I love it.
but
I'm like forming questions as you're talking
okay,
because
that's good. That's
yeah.
good. Well, I want to make sure it's hard to. I sometimes do this with the text in front of me because it's easier to just show. But yeah, so essentially, potentially lost gospel Q. There's also a lot of really interesting work happening right now around this possibility of a Marcion gospel. So there
That
was
was my
a.
next question. Keep
That
going.
was your next
Yeah, I
question.
can't wait.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there's a second century guy named Marcion of Sinope who was later considered a heretic, and he apparently had his own gospel that we just call the Evangelion, which just means gospel. And yeah, apparently his gospel was missing the first two chapters of Luke. So that's the nativity story. Marcion was, what do we know? So we know that, I think we know that he shared some similarities with what would later be described as Gnostics. So apparently, and we only know about him through the people who didn't like him, so it is
Right.
hard to know. But apparently, he believed that the God of the Jews was kind of a separate and evil God, and that Jesus was sent by a benevolent deity to save us from that evil God. Um, so his movement spread. It became quite popular, I think, for a few centuries, and then was condemned by the emerging proto-Orthodox Church. And then, as is often the case, we only find out about these. I'm putting air quotes here. See if I can get them in the screen. Heretics. We only find out about from their detractors. So you get all these stories. Like the one is fun that says Marcion seduced a virgin, and that was one of the reasons why this guy wasn't worth listening to. So um, there was yeah, do we take that seriously? I don't know, but anyway, so that's Marcion, and he did have a gospel, and apparently it looked kind of similar to the Gospel of Luke. So there's a question as whether Marcion's gospel fits within this triangle, that complicated diagram you already showed that I don't even think had Marcion in it.
It didn't.
Um,
That's what I
no,
want to
it's
know though
so
is
you can find. I mean, you can probably find one with Marcion in it. I know that the people working on this have a YouTube channel that you can actually check out. But so I think the most common they've tried to put Marcion in different places. I think right now the common. Let me see. Am I going to do this justice? I think the common belief right now is that Marcion may have had Luke may have had Marcion. So Luke may have been written as a response to Marcion, or it's possible that both Luke and Marcion shared another source behind and between Q and Mark, so or with Mark. Anyway, this is where it gets confusing because, and even Q, like people have hypothesized like different layers of Q, different. So it's incredibly complicated when you get into the details of the synoptic problem. So that's hopefully that kind of give you a taste. But let me know if I can clarify anything.
well, one of the questions that I wanted to ask, because I know the Christian response typically is going to be something like, well, Marcion had a copy of Luke because Luke was already written, and so Marcion was copying Luke. Are there any indicators that could lead us one way or another to know who was copying who, or if it was a shared tradition that is now lost to time?
I think that's what there's some. Oh, I'm just gonna look up the YouTube channel here.
I'll put it on the
Um,
screen.
oh, do you see the so there's what's the one they have? Patristica, I think it's called. You can find that.
Yeah, Patristica. Yep.
Yeah. So that's what, if you want to actually know about what they're doing and hear it better explained than I can possibly do it, you should check out this channel. So what they're essentially doing is they're using kind of computer science alongside of reconstructions of Marcion's Gospels from his detractors, his later detractors who quote him. So yeah, they will run through and do things like they'll do like a language analysis, and they'll say like, oh, Marcion used, or Marcion used this word so much, and Luke doesn't seem to use it as much, and so they're trying to do that kind of stuff essentially to figure out which came first. Um, yeah, so I think they're worth a follow if you haven't checked them out and you want to know
Yeah.
more about the subject. Yeah, so they're doing a lot with computer science, and I think it's really exciting. And I think that a lot of I mean a lot. One thing you realize if you study early Christianity, um, how much it's just such an exciting time. And unfortunately, I mean, I left academia. I'm not in it anymore, which is one of the reasons I'm doing YouTube for fun. But I think it's a very interesting time for biblical studies, um, because a lot of the we're kind of living at the edge of this questioning everything. Maybe academia is doing its own deconstruction. That
Yes.
there's a lot of stuff within early Christian, like history that just gets taken for granted. And then somebody comes along and says, like, wait a minute, we only know about Marcion from these people, a century or two later who hated him and were trying to destroy his reputation. And, so what if there's more to this story than just like he was a bad dude who had to be canceled? So you start asking these kind of questions, and all of a sudden you have this incredible opening of possibility. And I think that's one of the things that's really exciting. I've had a similar thing. I'm reading Brent Nongbury is the guy's name. He wrote a book called God's Library.
Mm.
And he basically just talks about how we've discovered biblical manuscripts, and basically so much of the way we think about the history of biblical manuscripts is kind of BS, and a lot of the dating is BS, and a lot of so he starts to look at these manuscripts, and when you'll hear people trot out, yeah, that's it. It's a good book. I'm halfway through. You'll hear people trot out things like, oh, this version of this copy of the Gospel of John was written in the 2nd century, and he goes, well, actually, could be second to the 4th century. So you start to see that when you start to question the things that people take for granted in this field, it gets a lot more interesting. Now, that, as you kind of alluded to, that can be terrifying to people who are coming from a fundamentalist angle. And it's really, I mean, to me, I think having trained as a biblical scholar, the most frustrating thing to me, especially somebody who still identifies as a Christian, is that, people could be doing this. It's not really a threat necessarily. If we could expand our mind to what actually, what being a Christian could actually be. But unfortunately, it turns into a lot of apologetics and oversimplification, and yeah, just in an attempt to keep this myth of biblical inerrancy alive. So I think it's really, I hope that keeps going. I was going to say, I think the other problem is, though, is a lot of the places where biblical studies gets done, there are a lot of institutions, especially in the US, that require statements of faith and will fire scholars for asking the wrong questions. And unfortunately, a lot of the biblical studies jobs are in those institutions, and they can be few and far between, and more kind of open-minded institutions, a lot of which are either religious studies faculties or associated with either the Catholics or mainline Protestant traditions. So yeah, I mean, it's both an exciting and terrifying time for the study of the Bible. But I think to be able to pull all this stuff apart and then do what this group of people is doing, that they're using like computer science models and stuff to look at language, and it's really really interesting.
So on the same topic, there's a duo, Matt and Jaron. They have an account on TikTok. They might be on YouTube now. They're starting to make the rounds on some of the YouTube shows. They're friends of mine, and they wrote a book called Christ Before Jesus, and
Okay.
they use stylometric analysis to determine whether or not the gospels can be dated to a particular range, and whether or not they've been influenced by later Greek texts and different things like that. And they kind of came to the conclusion that there's a very strong literary relationship between Marcion and Luke, and they're placing Luke way
Yeah.
late among the four gospels. And I, I don't want to get into bunch of Christ before Jesus lore. They're awesome. That's why I bring them up. I only say that to say that, Chris, it might be helpful for you or anyone else in the viewership to know that they exist. They're kind of new on the internet, and they want to bring
Cool.
their
I'll check them out.
styrometric
Yeah.
analysis to the forefront. My guess is that they're doing something very similar to the people that we just looked at their YouTube page. I think they're probably doing something in the same vein. So
Okay.
if you like one, you might like the other.
That's cool. I'll check them out. I just did a quick search and I didn't find them, but maybe you can send me the link after.
I'll send them over
Yeah.
to you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And just to say, I think that's kind of where dating's going with the Gospel of Luke. I think it's definitely likely being in the process of potentially being moved into the second century and not beyond second century and
Right.
beyond, no, but into the kind of early like 120 kind of thing. It could even get around there. So
Well, that was my feeling
yeah,
with Luke because it seems like Luke is cleaning up some of the problems of Mark, and just like Matthew did, like Mark 2:25 and 26 classically lists Abiathar as the high priest when David ate the showbread, and then when Matthew tells the story
yeah,
in chapter 12, Matthew's like, "We better cut Abiathar out of here. We did, oops." So when I read Luke, it seems like Luke is starting to spiritualize some of the more
yeah,
difficult claims of Mark, because if you spiritualize some of the claims, then it's easier to say, well, it wasn't a false prediction, or it wasn't something that you should look with your eyeballs and see. It actually happened spiritually. And to me, this makes the most sense if Luke is writing later and Luke is trying to give some explanation for, why is it that they expected the kingdom to come immediately, but where is it? And he says, "Oh, it's in your midst. You won't see it with your eyes. It's inside of you, right?" So it makes sense that Luke would be written later. But on the topic of the gospels, since we're
yeah.
there, do you think that it's possible that some of the gospels, if not, all of the gospels, were, we'll say, written over a period of time, meaning there was probably a core of material, and then there was additions made to it? A classic example would be the longer ending of Mark. Do we have
Right.
evidences of other items that could be attributed to a later time period finding its way into our gospels?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7 and John 8 is probably one of the most famous ones that doesn't appear in any early versions of John. I think before the 5th century, maybe. The story was around in some Latin manuscripts. Like it was kind of kicking around, I think, in some places, and there are a few references to it, but it's not in any of our copies of the Gospel of John. So it's generally kind of, I think most scholars agree at this point that it wasn't actually original to John and was put in later. So I mean, that's one example. I think so there's the stuff that we can see, and you mentioned the longer ending of Mark, which is yes, like we know that Mark originally just ended with the women leaving the empty tomb and saying nothing to nobody, and then the longer ending, somebody obviously didn't like that very much and tacked on a more satisfactory ending where they did a bunch of stuff, including handling snakes, which is unfortunate because a lot fewer people would die from snake bites if we didn't have that longer ending of Mark.
They just didn't have enough faith,
Anyway,
Chris.
yeah, that's right. Maybe they did. Yeah, who's the real Christian here? The people who are dying rattlesnake bites. Um, anyway, yeah. So I think there's that, but like that's only what we can see. That's just the relationship. One of the limits we have, and the reasons the Marcion stuff is so interesting, is because it's opening up the realm of possibility. There's a new papyrus well, it wasn't just found, but it was kind of recently identified from the Oxyrhynchus collection. It's like P-Oxy, what is it, 5575? Um, it's a new like just a fragment of a gospel currently dated I think to about the second century, and it has echoes of I think it's Matthew, Luke, and Thomas in it. So what's kind of I think what we see in when we yeah there you go yeah that's it. So
That's
there's if you
possibly bigger than P52 even.
it's a pretty big deal. I think people are kind of well there's if you it's big in the blogosphere. If you kind of do some searches, you'll get a lot of different people talking about it. But yeah, it's wild. So I think what it probably indicates is there was a lot more fluidity in the texts of the Gospels than we realize. I think we're certainly, as we make these hypotheses, like people will say, oh, Q is just a hypothesis and it doesn't, it doesn't mean anything. It's like, but we actually kind of can see this kind of, we see evidence of this kind of fluidity early on in the in the gospel writing, but we just can't really, because we're limited to what we have. So the more we discover like this, um, um, for example, the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, which happened a long time ago. The first, there was a few chunks of the Gospel of Thomas in Greek found at Oxyrhynchus around the turn of the last century, turn of the 1900s, and then there was a full copy of the Gospel of Thomas discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 in Coptic. And that was another sayings gospel. So scholars had hypothesized this sayings gospel Q, and then lo and behold, we had a sayings gospel. Now, Gospel of Thomas is not Q. It's probably riffing on Matthew and Luke, if anything. Um, like anything else, there's a lot of conversations about it, but it just goes to show that there were other gospels kicking around, and we have. When you read the church fathers, you'll see references to Gospel of the Ebionites, which was apparently written in Aramaic. There's Gospel of the Egyptians, Gospel of Peter. We actually have also, which you can Google. It's a fun one. The Gospel of Peter, where has this fun story about like Jesus coming out of the tomb and the cross comes out behind him, and Jesus, I think it's Jesus' head is like touching the sky, and it's a good one. So, and I think like the Gospel of Peter, for example, we find it in archaeology and art, and we have more like a lot of references to the Gospel of Peter from the first few hundred years of Christianity, where we don't have the same amount of references to the Gospel of Mark, for example. So this is just kind of showing us, I think, that there were a lot of gospels out there. There's probably a lot of fluidity among gospel traditions. And if the gospels we do have are clearly copying at least two, like are clearly copying other things, they're either copying, Matthew and Luke are copying Mark, or Matthew and Luke copy something else. We at least know that this kind of thing was pretty common, to copy and create and adjust and edit a gospel to maybe fit your theology, or maybe just to mix things together to make it more readable, or maybe I mean, yeah, we don't really know, I think, even the extent to which this was happening, but we just know it was happening. So I think there's a lot of possibility that there was a very, very fluid gospel tradition for the first, I don't know what I'm saying, I guess the first 100 years after Jesus.
Right. That was
Yeah.
kind of my feeling of, I studied a little bit of early Christianity. No, obviously nothing compared to what you did. Um, and my feeling was that there was a lot of varied beliefs of early Christianity. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people that were in a camp here, a camp there, a camp there, and they had some slightly different beliefs. And this idea, like in the modern age, we say, well, this is Christian orthodoxy. I don't know if we know what Christian orthodoxy is
In the modern age or in antiquity?
in antiquity. Is there such a thing?
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. I think I realized at some point studying this. I don't remember. I've heard other people say it since, but it kind of occurred to me as I was reading it. It was like there's more variation in ancient Christianity than in modern Christianity, because we're living after the movement of orthodoxy that tried to solidify everything into the same beliefs and stamp out everything that didn't agree. So I should expand on this a little bit, I guess. So, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312, and Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. And one of the things that Constantine apparently didn't like too much was the fact that the Christians were fighting over all these stupid little things, like the nature of Jesus or how the Trinity related to each other. So over a series of hundreds of years, not all started with Constantine, didn't end there. Different church councils came together and they said, okay, we got to get this stuff together. So, for example, in the fourth century, there was two councils of Nicaea to agree on the Trinity and what the Trinity actually was and how it related to each other. Um, so basically, what you have is this tradition at that point that solidified and became, I mean, it eventually broke into Catholic and Orthodox churches, and there's different, so there are some other splits and segmentations. But even so, I think you have more similarity across Christianity in the world today than in its first 100 years. And when you look at the fact that you have, like, the Gospel of Mark, for example, that Jesus, like, if you actually just imagine if you just read Mark, if you read it, it starts with Jesus' baptism. You get the Spirit comes into Jesus. I just did a video on this, so it's fresh in my mind. Spirit comes into Jesus at his baptism, drives him out into the wilderness, and then you have this thing that is called the messianic secret in Mark, where Jesus
Right.
basically
Don't tell
doesn't want
anyone.
anybody. Yeah, don't tell anybody. So like, oh, they start to maybe don't tell anybody. He warns them strongly, don't tell anybody. So you have a Jesus in Mark who basically we know there's something special going on, but we're not really actually sure what it is. And then we flip to Jesus in John, and all of a sudden Jesus is like, I am the Father of one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. It's like these are two very different people. So yeah, I mean, you have that kind of even within the Bible, like the New Testament itself is a construct of orthodoxy, and we've been trained to read it to read it all harmoniously. But if you actually read, I think, I mean, the famous one is James versus Paul, right? The faith without works is dead. In James, clearly a reaction to Paul, but we've come up with ways to kind of explain this and say, like, okay, well, there must have been, it's really just saying,
Mhm.
like, if you have faith, then there will be fruit, kind of thing.
Right.
So we find ways to harmonize this, but I think what you actually see, even in our New Testament, but it's certainly not all in the New Testament, but you see actually a lot more variety in early Christianity, which is really a lot more fun, to be honest. There's another one, the famous one in Revelation, where the churches to the letter to the churches in Revelation chapter 2, is it 2 and 3, somewhere around there, where it famously says, like, those who think they are Jews but are not. There's a fairly common, I don't know how common it is, but there's one interpretation that's actually talking about Pauline Christians, people who say they're Jews but are not.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, you get this kind of infighting, and it's really, I mean, there's a group called the Ebionites, were based in Palestine and thought that Paul was the enemy. I think there's other very like Petrine groups, or like other Christians who thought Paul was the worst thing to happen to Christianity. So it's just, you get a lot of this kind of infighting's, I guess that'd be the right way to say it, like jockeying. And then that's exactly what you have again coming back to Paul's letter, is you look at Paul saying, like, you guys need to stop listening to Apollos because I'm the guy. So
Right.
it's obviously like different traveling itinerant preachers trying to fight for the right to define what those groups should be, whether they should eat meat sacrificed to idols or not, or whether they should be circumcised or not,
Right.
and
Yeah.
different opinions on everything. So yeah, I mean, it's super diverse early Christianity. So yeah, I mean, if you looked back and read, just we're trying to get the doctrine of the Trinity. If I sat down with somebody who's never read it before and said, gave them the New Testament and said, describe to me the nature of God and how God, relates to God's self or whatever, I very unlikely that anybody would come up with the idea of the Trinity, right?
Right.
It's like it's more Greek theology, or it's more Greek philosophy than anything.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's funny that we were just so ignorant of that stuff, but also so affected by it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate you spending some time with me. I've had a blast. I know there's probably a million topics we could talk about, so hopefully we can dig deep into a singular topic sometime soon. But
Yeah, man.
I'd love to, if there are any videos or any projects that you're working on, can you tease them out to the audience? Because I know a lot of people in the audience are going to be curious to know if there's stuff that you have forthcoming that they should be aware of.
Yeah, for sure. I have a couple. I like doing big kind of roundup lists. So I had done one that was the four I mentioned earlier, but four biblical contradictions that cost me my fundamentalist faith. But I've got a couple coming up on, like, bizarre things in the Gospels, for example, digging into one of my favorite controversies, which is the secret Gospel of Mark, and the naked man who comes to visit Jesus at night,
Oh
which
my
is always a
gosh,
fun one.
yes.
Could be a forgery, so I'm not, might not even be real. So if anybody's already worried about it, maybe you can rest easy, because it's possible a forgery, but it's a fun case study anyway. So yeah, I'm going to be doing a few of those types of things. And then I mean, just as one of the reasons I wanted to start this channel was having gone through deconstruction. I mean, my deconstruction happened quite a long time ago, actually, but a lot of people I know are going through deconstruction right now. So I wanted to kind of give thoughts and reflections on how to move through it and, move beyond it. So that's why my channel has just been a mixture of biblical study stuff, trying to get back into some of the stuff that, as you can probably see from watching this, I'm a little bit rusty in some of the areas. So getting back into some of the stuff that I learned in all those years of education that I just don't do anything with anymore. And then yeah, like some stuff on deconstruction, and even probably re-exploring the possibility of faith after. But yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to hear
Yeah.
it. I can't wait to see what videos you have coming out next. And guys, if you're not already following Chris, you can find him. I'll pull up his YouTube channel and put it on the screen.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I've already watched most of your videos on mobile, and they're phenomenal. So if you're following
Oh,
me
thank you very much.
and you're not following Chris, then I implore you to do that already and share it with all your friends. When we find new people in the academic community that are sharing their knowledge with the public, we want to make sure that the public gets a hold of it, because Chris didn't just sit in like a basement somewhere just reading a bunch of books and then felt smart one day. He went to school, he got a proper education, and now he's sharing his knowledge with us, and he's not even charging us for it. So, Chris, we thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.